Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're a show dedicated to uncovering the beauty of the scriptures, probing big ideas in theology, philosophy, seeking wisdom for everyday life in our world. My name's Ryan John Gregg, and I'm sitting here with my friend Destiny Kennedy today.
Hey everyone.
And we're going to talk about a passage of scripture that's a little bit controversial. It's Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31. And in it, we meet this amazing, wise woman. She's a boss. She's amazing. And in Hebrew, the passage is an acrostic poem. Each subsequent verse starts with the subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's sort of like an A to Z compendium, everything you want to know about women. And for many in the church world, I would imagine the synagogue world as well, she's a profound role model. Actually, Jewish men typically on Sabbath evening will read Proverbs 31 to their wife at the Sabbath meal. However, in a world that has seen multiple waves of feminism, Proverbs 31 has often been pinpointed as a sort of a script of the patriarchy, or just such an incredibly high bar that nobody could possibly live up to. And it's very, if you try to, it's going to be very degrading. So we're going to talk about all that and more today, but also try to let the biblical text speak for itself. It's a sophisticated passage, not only internally, but moreover in what it's doing in relation to other things. So we've got a lot of cool stuff to talk about today. Destiny, thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
looking forward to it.
I'm curious, growing up, did you hear the phrase Proverb 31 woman? Was that like in your orbit? What did it mean? How did you feel about it? Can you give us some backstory there?
Yeah, sure. Well, my experience is localized, so I want to start out with that. But in my experience, so I grew up in California, but I grew up, I guess what you would call a proper church kid, and was regularly in church. My parents were extremely involved. And I think there was an expectation, even from the time I was a young girl, to be engaging with women's ministries. And so that was typically where, if Proverbs 31 was going to be expounded upon, generally speaking, it was going to be at a conference.
So women talk about this first? Because I never went to the women's conference.
Yes.
Y'all go and talk about Proverbs 31.
Yes. So actually,
wow.
In my experience, Proverbs 31 was primarily, the exposition of Proverbs 31 happened most frequently, if not almost exclusively in my experience, at women's conferences, Bible studies, that sort of thing, in women-only spaces. However, when I saw men talking about this scripture, it actually tended to be in context of talking about or actually executing, maybe you would call it church discipline, especially in marriage counseling, where there was a lot of conversations, or maybe I would overhear conversations in pastoral settings about how perhaps a woman didn't measure up or was a bit out of line because her husband didn't particularly feel like singing praises of her.
Oh, okay.
Or she wasn't exactly a woman of valor. And, there was kind of this, you're not quite measuring up, and this is what it means to be a biblical wife or to be a biblical woman. Or perhaps, every now and again, a funny joke from on stage from the pastor saying, like, my Proverbs 31 wife.
Oh, sickening.
And so
my super hot wife.
yeah, every youth pastor ever, minus my husband, because he knows that's off limits.
Does he ever say that about you?
Oh, no, he's not allowed to.
Oh, okay.
No,
okay.
I'm like, feel free to compliment me, but make it substantive. Like, don't give me these empty words here. No, but in truth, I think when Proverbs 31 is really looked into and enjoyed, which we'll talk about this more later, I think for what it actually is and what the scriptures are actually providing us with in it, and it's contextualized and appropriately treated, I think there's so much there to be enjoyed and to learn. But kind of going back to my experience, I would say something that was a bit difficult was when this scripture was talked about. Oftentimes it was kind of piecemeal. I like this verse, I like this verse, I like this verse. Yep. And then generally speaking, those select verses were kind of drawn out and turned into what the Proverbs 31 woman was. And then they were kind of morphed with kind of the cultural experience within church and home of like, what that's supposed to mean.
Right.
And in my experience as a young woman, being very competent in a lot of different areas and also being very passionate about church ministry, the hopes for pastoral ministry, especially as a teenager after I gave my life to Christ, I found that the exposition of this passage made this woman, this ideal woman, in fact, seem pretty non-substantive. Like there was very little substance to her. There was a lot of presentation as how you ought to look or how you ought to behave, and it was very difficult to always pinpoint what about her was so special, other than the fact that she kind of owed herself to other people and was generally pretty kind and, maybe courageous because she trusted in God, but it was very vague to understand what that meant. And also I felt like every single preacher always drew from the same lineup of examples of what that meant to be the Proverbs 31 woman.
Preachers never reuse examples. They are always original.
I wish that were true.
I'm a preacher.
And
I'm always original.
In that sense, I think it was a bit of a struggle for me to not feel a little bit like there was just a shrunken imagination. Like it wasn't that they were hitting wrong per se on certain examples. It was just to say that it was like, man, this isn't very expansive. It feels like there's just such a small area in which I can live and express whether it be biblical womanhood or become like this Proverbs 31 woman. And so that was frustrating. And then on the flip side, experiencing conversations with people who didn't know Christ and even just larger cultural conversations, I realized that though the narrative was, hey, the feminist movement is expanding what it means to be a woman and is giving greater space, and our horizons are growing, and there's nowhere but up to go. And I felt like my experience of the movement was actually very similar in the sense that it felt like the circle was shrinking. It felt like the body of what womanhood is, if we were to give an analogy or a metaphor. If womanhood is a body, it's like saying to the arm of biblical womanhood, as it was kind of culturally mashed up in a particular way, chopping off that arm and saying, that's not what we want. We have to chop this arm off to get everything else. And to me, that was just not wisdom. It was like, why can't this arm continue to exist and dignity in the home and in work in the home continue to exist, especially being someone with a biblical background, recognizing the dignity of marriage and having kids and that worthy work, wanting that myself, but also saying there's also other elements to the expression of womanhood, and why can't we have both arms? Why can't we be a complete body? Yeah. Why do we have to chop off all these limbs and be at war with one another and simply say, this is a complex, difficult conversation, but maybe God has a more expansive, more imaginative, more broad, but also well-boundaried direction for us to go, if that makes sense. And this is even difficult for me to talk about right now because I'm still, as a 27-year-old woman, in the process of asking questions like, what does it mean to not just be a woman and to express that womanhood in the world as it is right now, but what does it mean to be a woman who loves God? And what does the expression of that look like in the areas in which I inhabit my life, my home, schooling, pastoral ministries, all the things, as they say. So
those are some big questions. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. And I didn't know that's what all you women talk about at women's retreats. I'm actually not sad. I'm not sad I wasn't there.
Yeah.
Although in college, me and my buddies decided one time to sneak into the women's conference, the college women's conference or whatever, and we did a dance on stage, and I think we were dressed up as like thugs, but underneath we had like some wild outfit on. I don't know. We were idiots. We were 20.
How old? You were 20?
19. I was 19. And
it's a little old.
I know. For
a stunt like that.
Whatever.
Oh, that's too funny.
Yeah. So I think I love what you were saying about shrinking circles of imagination, and the idea that if you read the Bible and you're into the Bible, that means you're like foreclosing all the answers. Like, well, you just have it. Actually, no. The Bible, properly understood, is what blows wide open possibilities and blows open the questions. So, a little bit of cultural background here in terms of what we're swimming in these days. The 20th century French philosopher, writer Simone de Beauvoir, in her book, The Second Sex, famously said, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." And by that, and this is such a key insight to understand, let me say it again, one is not born, but becomes a woman. And here, this is the very well-known, although disputed, distinction today between sex and gender, biological sex as something that you're born with, and gender as layered social conventions on that that give you a sense of expectations in terms of how you should live out your sex.
Right.
And so, and Beauvoir was building on prior pillar texts in the feminist movement. I mean, there's waves of feminism. Very important was like Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Right of Women, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Feminism, to my understanding, is a very multifaceted arena where there's a lot of internal disagreement over several things.
Tons of internal dialogue, absolutely.
Over things like, for example, like prostitution. And should a woman, so like body positive feminists would say, of course a woman can use her body however she wants. If she wants it to be her means of livelihood, well, who are you to stop her? And then others would say, no, that's fundamentally degrading. And even if you want to, you shouldn't. And these kinds of things are on the ballot. I mean, we're in California.
Yes.
Prostitution, I believe, is currently illegal, but over in Nevada, it's not. And I think some want it to be legal here. So there's that kind of thing. But what we have seen the emergence of in the last, this is all arbitrary, 60, 70, 80 years, is sort of the gender neutral society, and the idea that really to call out any differences between men and women in any way, you are on thin ice, and you are really going to get yourself in trouble unless you just pretend that there really is no difference between men and women. And Christianity has its own version of this debate. There's two sort of broad camps, although I'm sure some would want to say, let's use different language, but there's been sort of the egalitarian camp, which has said, it's gender neutral. There's no difference between men and women. And then there's sort of a complementarian camp that says, no, there actually is a difference. And as we talk about like sameness or difference, it has to do with questions of value. Are we same in value?
Right.
Are we same in function?
Right.
And so I think, I think essentially an egalitarian would say yes and yes to both those questions of value and function. A complementarian would say yes and no.
Correct.
They would say, yes, radically equal in value.
Right.
But there are different functions. It's a partnership. And they'd point to a passage like Genesis 1, where God creates the world in this elaborate system of fruitful contrasts, day, night, heavens, earth, land, water, these opposites that work together. And then crowning that is man, woman, and these differences that work beautifully together.
Yeah, and I think it's important in much the same way you pointed out that there's internal dialogue between even the different waves of feminism. I think that within the church, there's been plenty of dialogue over, especially in recent history, especially the past 20 years in particular, but lots of conversation about what does this mean, and both parties doing their best to use kind of the origin story of humanity in Genesis to make sense of how we're supposed to live our lives. I mean, in sympathy with this whole conversation on whether in the feminist arena or in the Christian church, there is just a deep longing to understand how am I to live and express myself appropriately, and especially for a Christian woman or Christian man, how do I live my life unto God in such a way that is really honoring to him and honoring to the males and females in my life, my children, right? And so, yeah, again, I want to keep the charity to that conversation while also saying that with each position comes perhaps sometimes even an overemphasis, maybe one overemphasizing partnership to the exclusion of the potential for a difference in function, or this is a very loaded term, but role.
Yeah.
That is a conversation that can be so frustrating for a lot of people.
And then to add a whole nother layer for Christians, it's not just roles and functions between men and women. It's in the church as well. So the whole question of women in ministry is a parallel conversation, but not the same as roles in a household.
And some would
so
say
there are some churches where there's
ecclesiology and home are one and the same. It should be the same conversation. Others should say, no, they're different. And others bring it back and say, no, they're one and the same, but we don't land in the same place as the other ones who say it's one and the same. So yeah, there's that leveling.
But I think the thing is, and soon I want to get to the passage because it's just so good.
Yes,
absolutely. I think I'm put in mind of Ephesians chapter 5, this passage on husbands and wives. But at the top of the passage, it says, "And submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." That statement utterly turns on its head the background assumptions of so much of the conversation today, because a lot of the feminist movement, in step with a lot of other critical theories, assumes that the baseline reality of our world is power. It's all about power. Every gesture, every look. I mean, it's like Google the phrase "the male gaze," and the very ways men look at anybody is objectifying and is, don't
mansplain, Ryan.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. See, what can I do?
No.
But
I hear you.
Power. It's all about power.
Right.
And which is not to say that's not a real thing. But boy, if the whole conversation is about actually, how can I better submit to you? How can I better serve you? How can I better bring out the authentic in you? Boy, that changes the whole tenor of the conversation,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a wrestling. And this is where we begin to realize that it's not simply about the expressions of womanhood and manhood, but it's also about the character from which those expressions come. And being deeply shaped by Jesus really changes that. And also, I've had to recognize, even in my own approach to the scriptures, that I must always say, if I don't like the answer, that doesn't change the answer. I don't get to just look the other way. I'm in a position as a Christian to say, if I've done my best and I have scoured and I have learned and I have pressed in, and this is an ongoing journey and process, but hear me out, you know what I'm saying? And I land somewhere the text puts the burden of proof on me, and I'm just like, I don't like that. What then? And I think right now the conversation in culture is, well, that's authoritarian. So,
and the whole idea of saying, you know what?
That's control, that's power.
Yeah, the whole idea of saying an appropriate ethical response here is obedience.
Right.
Well, that just
Absolutely.
means
you've
internalized the patriarchy.
Right.
You've internalized misogyny.
Right.
Poor you. And so...
I'm to be pitied. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so these frameworks become non-falsifiable, which means... In fact, I was at this lecture one time by this law professor, actually well-known guy, Cass Sunstein. He was big in the Obama administration, and he was talking about social policies or whatever. They were looking at happiness quotients of certain, in this case, women. And the data that they got from their surveys was that women who were working a lot or doing a bunch of stuff that were sort of championed by feminism were actually less happy. And the way that he tried to make sense of that was to say, well, I think they've just internalized misogyny or something like that. And I raised my hand and I said, well, wait a minute. Isn't your framework non-falsifiable then? Because how could you, anytime there's data that that doesn't fit the preferred narrative, you have an out, actually, to say, this gets into a whole other conversation. It has to do with this question of false consciousness. You don't fundamentally understand what's even being done to you. You're so blinded to the realities, and poor you. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is there are huge assumptions often in the background of how we even ask these questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to become aware of those things.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. This whole conversation, I think, as we move into the actual text itself,
Yay.
is helpful, because when you don't have the way and wisdom of God grounding you,
Mm-hmm.
Narratives are like tidal waves
Mm-hmm.
that will just carry you out to sea.
Mm-hmm.
And we reference narratives that are out there, but also the internal reality and the expression of sin that we each carry, bending us pretty
Another
consistently.
very controversial topic.
Yes. And again, I recognize that me making that claim is controversial, and not every listener may agree with me, even on that point. But coming from that assumption, Proverbs is going to speak very clearly to the need for trust in God beyond what we are able to process and comprehend in any single moment, for the guidance of our life and for our best interest. And yet also balance that with the fact that we can share wisdom with one another. And there are things that can be known and learned from this life. So let's talk about Proverbs 31.
Let's do that.
And this particular woman, actually in Proverbs 31, to this point in Proverbs, there have been many women actually that have played a big role, two of them being Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, both of whom seem to be personifications of wisdom and folly.
Right.
So how does Proverbs 31 then map on to the wider strategy that's happening in the book?
Yeah. Proverbs, like all other books in the Bible, have a narrative shape or a structure of some sort, and that structure is vital to discerning the meaning of the book. That is to say, seeing the structure is not just an extracurricular. It's like ground zero of trying to say, like, what is... I can't disagree with something till I know what it is, what the something is.
Sure. And if you hope to extract meaning from it, you have to know how it's been formed.
Right. And what are the rules? What am I even looking for here? So this is where sort of a wide angle lens has some very, very rich things to point out. So I'll just kind of go rapid fire here. At the beginning of the book, the implied listener, who's a young man, is introduced to Lady Wisdom, and she's introduced as like a marriageable, like you're invited into a marriage style relationship with her. Cling fast to her, serve her, live with her, and you'll be glad you did. And so the woman in Proverbs 31 is sort of like almost the human reflex of Lady Wisdom, who is herself just sort of a personification of wisdom itself. That contrasts with another woman we meet early in the book, Lady Folly. She sounds a lot like Lady Wisdom, but she's going to lead to death. And there's a human reflex for her too, the adulteress or the foreign woman and so forth. So there's sort of this
When you say reflex, you mean like a counterpart of sorts?
Yeah, mirroring.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, yep. So there's a sort of an arc of education for the young listener. We're sort of like early Proverbs. Okay, here's you want to go for wisdom, but you want to avoid folly. But early on in Proverbs, there's also strong warnings against adultery, strong warnings against prostitution and stuff like that. And so it's like right out of the gate saying, okay, wait, don't approach this woman. But then at the very end of the book, here's Proverbs 31. It's like, approach this woman. And in between is like, here's the curriculum of life you need to know to be worthy of her. You know, like I've heard this joke, he's sort of like, hey, are you Proverbs 31 woman? Yeah. Are you a Proverbs 1 through 30 man? And if the answer's not yes, then you don't get no Proverbs 31 woman.
Well, you know what? I appreciate that, just because I think, and this narrative has been a little bit commandeered by the feminist movement, but I think to some legitimate degree, there is a feeling sometimes of like, man, who's going to tell the guys like that they have something to aspire to as well? Why are we the ones always out, being told to fall in line and look a certain way or whatever? And I think both are skewed, but I just thought it's funny because sometimes comedic relief is illuminating.
Yeah.
And turns the conversation on its head. Well, yeah, what if you did say that to a guy? Like, all right, you got 30 chapters, bro. Let's go.
Right. No, exactly.
And in a sense, God is saying that to both parties.
Yeah.
There is an expectation. There is a that we may rise to, and thank God in Christ with the Spirit's help. But it's a journey.
Yep. All right. So there's a few more parallels.
Please. Yeah.
The beginning of the book is dominated by the voice of the father, sort of a father speaking to his son. Proverbs chapter 31 is spoken in the voice of a woman, actually.
Right.
In verse
yes?
1, it says, just translating, it says, the words of Lemuel, the king of a place called Massah, that his mother taught him. And she says, what, my son of my womb, son of my vows. And so it ends with the voice of a mother. The beginning is Israel-centric, Solomon, king in Jerusalem, whatever. This guy here, Lemuel, is a foreign king. Massah is not in Israel. And the whole genre of wisdom literature is very international in its flavor. It's drawing from, it's in conversation with wider pursuit of wisdom. We'll circle back to that in a bit. Two things that are really, really important. Throughout the book, several times the author circles back to the idea that the foundation of knowledge and of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. That's the baseline. And that is just where Proverbs 31 ends. In verse 30, which is a great verse, we'll come back to it. The second half of the verse says, a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And so it's circling back at the very end of the book to the spine. I mean, the steel at the center of the book has been the fear of the Lord. Just so, another major theme in the book has been trust. Throughout the book, it says to the reader, don't trust your own heart. Don't trust your wealth. Don't trust your own strength. Don't even trust other people. They're probably going to let you down. Trust God alone. But at the very beginning of Proverbs 31, in verse 11, the heart of her husband trusts in her. And so it's like saying, like, this is a person of a quality that is actually trustworthy. And we should say, like, at the big level, and we'll come back to this as well, Proverbs 31 is an ideal composite. It's not meant to be any one woman. It's a sort of it's a genre that's like hero literature almost, that's talking about, like, here's this amazing portrait. But no one ever lives up to all of this. And so that's important to say up front. It's not like, maybe if you live on a 19th century farm somewhere and you are actually doing all these things, maybe some women are this multi-talented or whatever. It's an ideal.
Or perhaps in a way that we might say, this having been used as more of maybe the metaphor of a blueprint to build a house, right? You're going to follow it exactly, and you're going to get the result.
Yeah.
Versus the idea of wisdom as emulation, as aspiring, as working toward, as recognition of current position and aspired position, and being in constant dialogue with that. Is that what you're getting at? Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So there are some pretty elaborate connections between Proverbs 31 as well as the rest of Proverbs, and also with the wider Bible.
Right.
Do you want to talk about those even?
Yeah.
Because I think that will help us re-dignify Proverbs 31. It's kind of lived on its own for a long time, and I've never experienced it in connection to the greater biblical story and even in other passages. So I would love to.
This is if you understand this one principle, it will change the way you read the Bible. The Bible talks to itself across boundaries that we might think would make it not talk to itself. So, as an example of that, it is not at all coincidental that in the Hebrew ordering of the Bible, right after Proverbs is the book of Ruth. So right after the Proverbs 31 woman, we have this story of Ruth, and she's the only other person in the Bible called, in the Hebrew phrase is Eshet Chayil, which is usually translated as woman of valor.
Right.
And it says in Ruth chapter 3, verse 11, that she's a woman of valor, Eshet Chayil, who is praised in the city gates. Now, that is the A and the Z of Proverbs 31, actually.
Yes.
At the very beginning, she's a woman of valor. At the very end, she's praised in the city gates. And that maps directly on to Ruth. And she's, just as Proverbs 31 is the oracle of a foreign queen who at the end talks about Yahweh, Ruth is this foreign woman who comes to faith in Yahweh. And then right after the book of Ruth in the Hebrew ordering is the Song of Songs, which is spoken in the majority. The woman is the speaker. She initiates the relationship. She also, in many ways, heals what's going on back in the Garden of Eden. One of the curses in the Garden of Eden, God says to the woman, "Your desire shall be for your husband,
Right.
and he shall rule over you." And this is key because the idea of the conflict of the genders is, in the Bible's view, a product of the fall. It is a complication produced by sin. But in Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 11, she says, "I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me." And so she's turning around, using the exact same language as Eden, and yet turning it around. So if you wanted to check this out, Genesis 3:16, your desire shall be for husband, he shall rule over you. And then Genesis 4:7 in the Cain and Abel story, where God says, sin's desire is for you, but you shall rule over it. So it's interesting stuff going on there. The Bible, you could do a whole study on this, but the Bible has many women who are like saviors for men. Think of the Moses story.
Sure.
You've got these midwives duping Pharaoh. Then you've got this woman who's hiding her baby, and then his sister's walking, and then the princess picks him. Like Moses is triply saved by women.
Yeah.
And he's the savior, but he is first radically saved. Or you think about David, saved by Abigail, who's, David's going to go, literally, he says, "Woe to me if by tomorrow any man who pisseth against the wall is still alive." That's David. He was a crusty guy. It's also like the most hilarious verse in the Bible. And Abigail jumps in his way and says, no, don't do that, because that's going to backfire on you politically, and plus you don't want blood on your hands and all this stuff. Think of Esther. She saves the Jewish people. Ruth, ancestress of David. Think of, this is a famous one, Judges chapter 5, 4 and 5, Deborah and Barak. Here's Barak, this male military leader. He's a total coward. And Deborah comes in and saves the day. And then this woman, what's her name? Yael. She runs the hammer through the head of Sisera. And the scene is actually like totally sexual. He's like, and he got down on her knees and he, and then it's like, and then she rammed him through. It's an amazing story. And it's filled with innuendo.
Yep.
Rahab saves the spies, Jericho. There's also tons of stories about men whose downfall is a woman. Whether it's, there's all sorts of stories here. Think of Judah in Genesis 38 with his daughter-in-law. He doesn't even know it. She's dressed up like a sex worker, and oops, Bathsheba. There's a ton. We don't need to go through the list. But I think what's key is in Proverbs 31, it says in verse 12, she gives him good and not evil all the days of her life. Good and evil.
Sounds a bit like an Eden reference.
That's Eden language, exactly. And so the idea that the complications began with a gendered interaction between men and women and a snake that went sideways, but she brings him good and not evil. It's Eden language. It's mapping on there. And then, of course, just a couple other things. Jesus, he elevates women in a profound way. A lot of his disciples, a lot of his benefactors are women. When the whole Mary and Martha story, when Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus and Martha's griping, she's not so much griping because like, hey, help with the chores. She's kind of griping because it's like, hey, Mary thinks she's one of the guys who's going to become a teacher. Because to sit at the feet of the master was like, I'm an understudy and someday I'm going to be a teacher too. And so Martha's like, hello, she can't do that. And Jesus is like, no, she's chosen the better portion. And, if the essence of what the Christian church is that community that proclaims the resurrection of Jesus as Messiah, well then on Easter morning for a few hours, the whole church was female because the first people to whom Jesus appeared and who knew of the resurrection were all women. Go and tell my brothers. So, and then Paul, of course, and the way women led in the early church and the way the church itself is a bride. I mean, the New Testament, particularly when viewed in its cultural norms, is deeply, deeply committed to the dignity of women. And, we'll get here into the passage itself, but here we have a woman who is empowered for business transactions. She's buying real estate. She's running inventory and merchant. Like, she's an empowered woman, which is something that happens. My wife's a business owner, and my heart trusts her so easily. I love my dear
Rightfully
wife.
so.
Yeah, but back in the day, this was a lot more. I don't want to use the word subversive, but it was certainly less common than it is today.
Sure.
And so there's a host of connections, but without even reading the passage, but just being aware of how its lines of connection nearby to Ruth, Song of Solomon, a little bit further, all the way to Genesis, or the whole thematic of women who either save or destroy men, to the way that women figure in the ministry of Jesus and in the radical growth of the early church. So it's worth connecting the dots between Proverbs 31 and all these other things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And worth it because treating the story as deeply interconnected while also remembering that each, whether it's a story, a narrative, a poem, treating it on its own terms is going to help us actually connect the dots, not just meaningfully, but more accurately, and hopefully create a cohesive picture for the partnership and complementarity of the male-female reality that God created. And as we continue to learn what that means and express that in the world, there is healing that's released. And to me, that's a helpful, I don't know if boundary is the right word, but a helpful marker, a helpful flag to notice is what, when asking the questions of what am I to do, or how am I to live, how am I to express this thing, is healing. Is healing the way that the Bible describes it, and the vision that the scriptures have that God has given us for where we're on our way to, and the kingdom that God has given us, is that healing being expressed and a reality. And it's helpful as a guide. But
You want to read the passage?
I would love to, so that we can kind of get more
get granular.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
All right, starting in verse 1. The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him.
Okay, so let me just say these first 9 verses, the hymn to the virtuous woman starts in verse 10.
Okay.
But if you want to read
Yeah.
the first 9 verses, that's great. We can read the whole chapter.
Okay, let's do it. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, your ways to who...
Okay, let me pause there. So, because this is also in Proverbs 31.
Yes.
This queen, mother, says to her son, wait a minute. Don't give your strength to women. Now, the plural there, women, as opposed to woman, seems to indicate the idea of prostitutes or harem, as if to say, she's not saying women as such are bad. She's saying... this maps onto the theme in the early part of the book, the foreign woman, the seductive, treacherous woman, whatever. It's mapping onto there.
When we risk, again, when we disassociate ourselves with the speaker and the hearer, then we risk unnecessary scandal or unnecessary harm, because the reality is, if this is a young man who is likely at some point going to rule, and in a foreign context, it would almost be expected that a harem of women would exist for him, or something like that, right? Then his mother's wisdom comes as deeply caring, and not just don't let women waste your energy, they're not worth it, something like that. Where if we're decontextualizing things, it's just easy to get offended for no reason.
Right. But I love being offended. It's why I get up in the morning.
Honestly, I think we have sometimes a bit too much of an addiction to it. But as we continue in verse 3, don't give your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And then in verse 10, we move into a description of the woman who fears the Lord. An excellent wife who can find? She's far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with very willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates.
Did anything stand out to you on that pass?
How infrequently most of these verses are actually talked about.
Yeah, because what the heck is a distaff and spindle?
You know, I think that's part of the
It's textiles. How you make clothes.
Well, but what keeps us away from this is like, you're not talking my language.
Right.
Move on.
Right.
Oh, charm
Yeah.
is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. I can talk about that, you know. But
can I talk about that verse though for a second?
Please.
Oh, I love this verse. In Hebrew, let me read it to you in Hebrew.
Okay.
Sheker achen v'hevel hayofi. Isha yirat Adonai hi titalal. Why I like this is in Hebrew, it puts a sharper pinch on it. The first says literally, charm is a lie. It's not deceptive. Deceptive is an adjective. In Hebrew, it's a noun. Charm is a lie. And beauty is a breath, is nothing. It's the word that like...
Is it hevel?
Hevel, exactly.
Really?
It's hevel. Yeah, which in the book of Ecclesiastes
word,
is
yeah.
hevel, hevelim. And like, sort of vanity of vanities, whatever. It's nothingness. Mm-hmm. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Now, this doesn't mean that... it doesn't mean, well, therefore, if you fear the Lord, you should try to be ugly and mean. Because clearly, only women who love the Lord are ugly and mean. No, you can also be charming and beautiful and fear the Lord.
Sure.
But it's basically saying, like, don't be deluded by these superficial things.
Yes.
How many times? I am chronically bad. My first impressions of people are wrong all the time. My first impressions of people that irritate me very often end up becoming good friends. And my first impressions of people that I'm often like impressed with at the beginning, after a little while, I'm kind of like, you're kind of a putz. I don't really like you. I don't even know what putz means, but you're a putz.
That's funny.
All that to say is, it's saying those things to which we're often quickly attracted can be false advertising. Yeah, but it's not saying
What I'm hearing you say is that the substance of this woman that makes what she does and who she is so meaningful is her trust in the Lord, her consistent, resolute,
Yep.
strong remaining in her trust and fear of God.
Yes.
And I think going back to our earlier conversation when I said, what is substantive about the Proverbs 31 woman? I feel that it's very hard to grasp. Maybe we can talk some more about like how does Proverbs 31 ground that? It starts at fear of the Lord, but what other activities does it name?
Great example. So great question. So there's an important contrast here between the fear of the Lord and the attitude of this woman. Her attitude is one of confidence, even carefree laughing at days to come.
Yes.
So her groundedness in a certain fear produces actually another emotional disposition of sort of freedom,
comfort,
laughter,
and freedom. Yeah.
and that attitude is based in wisdom. So it's not just sort of a carefree, we'll figure it out sort of
ignorance
attitude.
is bliss.
No, it's like, no. The reason I can laugh
Right.
at days to come is because I did my work. Like I worked hard and I've prepared for winter in advance. And I've really thought through my real estate purchase. Thank you very much. Like I know all of the details. And so her confidence comes from diligence, from so I think that's one thing is her attitude is one of confidence. It's also one of kindness. The law of kindness. She cares for the poor. So there's actually let me see if this helps a little bit. There's a let's see, what scholar is this? I think this is Tremper Longman. Observes a certain flow. No, this is Bruce Waltke. Observes a flow through this poem. It starts with her general worth. A virtuous woman who can find? She's really hard to find. She's really rare. But then it gets more specific worth to her husband. Her husband's heart trusts in her. She's worth more than rubies and all that stuff. Then it moves into her cottage industry at home. She's created some sort of like little business at home, and she's like actually making a lot of money. It's what she's doing at the home. But then it moves to her social achievements and the way in which she's making an impact in her wider city and context. Then she's praised. And at first she's praised by her family. Let her husband arise and call her blessed, and her sons and children and all this. But then her praise comes from everybody. Let her praise, let her works bring her praise in the city gates. And so looking at it one way, you could see that sort of progression starts with worth, goes from general to specific. It goes from what she does in the home and in the community, and then how she's praised by her family and then by the community as well. So that's one way to look at it. I don't know. Does that help at all?
Yeah. And I guess just for practical purposes, all of that sounds wonderful. And we've already kind of established that this is kind of an image of qualities to aspire to, activities that aren't just, I don't need to become a purchaser of real estate to embody,
exactly.
Embody what it is that's trying to be communicated here. But I think it is also helpful just to go on the record and say, or maybe I could pose it as a question, are these activities descriptive things that I have to be doing, right? To be.
Well, you better go find your distaff and your spindle.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Go to Hobby Lobby or to Joann's Fabric or Michael's. You can go get your distaff and your spindle. No. So
if I couldn't make sourdough bread if it was made for me.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like as a woman seeing movements of women who are very organically kind of trying to get back to like how do I appropriately express my womanhood and who find genuine joy in these types of activities or even growing their own food, things like that. When for me as a more urban grown woman who I would be very open to learning those things, but it's also like, is that what that means to be like a Proverbs 31 woman or like a biblical woman? Like, or how do we treat this text so that we're drawing still the heart of it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And to use a specific example for you, Destiny, if I might.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You and this will be interesting for you to know, listeners, viewers, is that you oversaw the project of this room. Like this was an ugly closet like a month ago. But Destiny led a team of probably 7 or 8 people, and we're not done. We actually have a little bit more to do. But there's been so many different things to attend to in making this space usable for what we're doing.
Right.
And I think that's like squarely what this is talking about. And because the common denominator is energy, is competence, is skills, a lot of different skills. And so that's how this is transferable to our context. And I think you're doing a great job.
Oh, thank
with
you so
that
much.
kind of stuff.
And in terms of the application, I think it's normative for us to assume, well, all of Proverbs is speaking to male and female, despite the fact that we know there's a male speaker, a father, right, speaking to what is most appropriately a young male, up and coming.
Well, yes and no. Let me jump in there, because the way the Proverbs is set up, and this is a different podcast, which maybe we should do. Proverbs democratizes wisdom from the get-go.
Okay.
So it has a certain sort of frame of father to son.
Sure.
But if you study Proverbs chapter 1 and those early chapters, it's very clear that the intended readership is beyond the father-son axis.
Right. And I
it
think
democratizes it.
You're saying
So it's not just for men.
Right.
It's the whole thing is for women.
And that's exactly the point that I was trying to make. And thank you for probably saying it a little bit more clearly. Because in much the same way that Proverbs 31, I would like to maybe posit that it's very possible you could benefit from
You think I could benefit
many
from
of
this?
these. Yeah, I do think so.
Okay.
And men in many ways can be enterprising and deeply kind and all the things, right, certainly that are listed here.
So much of these things are throughout the book. So
Right.
like when it talks
yes.
about an energetic woman,
Correct.
Proverbs has been railing against lazy boneheads the whole time.
Yes. And that's what I'm saying. This isn't just like and pause for the female portion, right?
Right.
That's what I'm trying to get across is that this is a conversation for the male-female reality that God created in the garden. And for us to, what I don't want to do is totally eliminate the fact that being male and female can benefit from kind of the more focused conversations about how each sex is to live. But there is a general conversation here happening that we can all benefit from. And again, I say that as relief to just this constant, I think, incessant feeling sometimes that particularly women have, that it's just like, this conversation's for you and that's for them.
Yep.
And again, what we're not trying to do is neutralize and just eliminate all differences, but to say that in Christ, to build the character of Christ is the mission of every male and female.
Yes.
And I think that is where that lies. It's not rooted in each sex. It's rooted in the purposed living of each sex toward becoming like Christ.
Well, that'd be a great spot to land the plane.
Awesome.
Very well said.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Friends, I hope you benefited from it. I hope you had fun. We are a ministry of the Bay Church, and we have fresh spaces and fresh faces on the way. We're really looking forward to some of what we're going to release over the spring and summer. And we would love to see you join us at the Bay Church, either online or in person on a Sunday morning. And you can go to thebay.church to figure out how to do that. But friends, thank you so much for joining us. And Ryan, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
We'll see you guys soon.
And as the rabbis say, shalom, me homies. Take care. Bye-bye.